we have discussed the whatever the initial, the essentials for writing an analysis of the case study. First, we have talked about the framing. In the framing, we have talked about what are the objectives, identify the template was created, template was talking about identify the key questions, flip through the case, skim read the case, carefully read the beginning and end of the case, and on the basis of by the first reading and then second reading we will be come out with the framing of the case study. Second will be the labeling of the case study. In the labeling of the case study, we will go through the whatever the general inputs are given in the case, industry specific inputs are given in the case, inputs related to the competitors of a particular company, not of the industry, those points we will note down. We will also note down the strengths and weaknesses of that particular case study given in that case study about a particular company. Then third will be the summarizing. In summarizing, we will talk about the facts on the basis of all these the competitors and strengths and weaknesses. We will summarizing the facts and eliminating the unimportant points. The case is written in the context of the certain other situations happening during that particular event which the case has discussed, but maybe that may not be relevant as far as the problem of the case is concerned. So, if it is not related to the problem of the case, then definitely we have to eliminate unimportant that parameters. Now, certain information which is essential but redundant, then that information also we will eliminate from that particular case study. Then we will mark most important, that is the information in the summarizing what is the most important information is there for the case study that we will discuss. After framing, labeling and summarizing, now we will go for the synthesizing of this particular case study. We are already discussing the Singapore International Airlines case study for this particular synthesizing purpose. What are the steps and what are the tips in this synthesizing process? The key question is what are the options are available. I would like to narrate here one example, that is when we are talking about the options, we have to keep in the mind the STEEP process: social, technical, economical, ecological and technological process that we have to keep into the consideration. If we are keeping these all legal also, so therefore all these options, all these factors when we consider, then only we will be able to provide the right option. State the 1 to 3 key questions, decide what the few key questions to the case are. Note that it may be that there is only one key question. It is possible that is there are not the number of the key questions and there will be only one key question. Tips are how to identify these questions. Go back to the key questions identified in the first step, because whenever we are going through the case study at a glance, in the first step we will be able to identify the key question. Sometimes if it is the close ended case, then definitely there will be direct question will be there and we have to answer those questions. So, trainees can be trained on that particular way, but if it is the we have to find out the questions because it is open ended case, then we have to ask the trainees, that is go back to the key question identified by you in the first step. do not include more than 3 key questions, otherwise they likely are not key, because whenever we talk about that something is important, something is having the key factor, then definitely everything cannot be the key factor. There will be only 2-3 key factors, there will be questions will be 2-3 key questions, there will be 2-3 key personnel. So, therefore, in that case, that is whenever we are the key questions we talk about the first question, second question and maximum third question. So, there can be only 3 key questions can be there whenever we are identifying the 3 key questions in a particular case study. Identify the options. What it means? Means stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, right. For each question, list out the options or the alternatives using the MIS format as described in the tips. So, what is mutually exclusive for Singapore Airlines? So, those points will be noted down, that these are the issues which are very mutually exclusive for the Singapore International Airlines. Then they will be collectively exhaustive, that is not applicable only to the Singapore Airlines, but it may be applicable to the aviation industry. So, therefore, what we will say, that is they are collectively exhaustive key points are there, and therefore, the options will be, that is not only the mutually exclusive for the Singapore Airlines, but this can be applicable to other airlines also. Examples of MIS are timings, for example, day or night, profit, revenues or expenses, expand overseas, yes or no, and etc. Therefore, each option means that is the mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, that will be taken into consideration, and those options will be written down as a part of whatever the final option will be there, a final solution will be there, these options will be evaluated. Here I would also like to mention, that is always we go by the formula, that is identify as maximum options as much available, another tip is there, and then evaluate the options and then select the best option. So, that is also a method of decision making process. So, in the decision making process, this becomes very popular, that is how that we have to consider all these aspects in the case of the MIS process is there. Now, whenever we are identifying the options, then in identifying the options, that is the MIS option as I talked about, I was talking about, that is the how other approach can be there. Whatever options are there, you have to identify the options, and on those options we have to go for the evaluating the options, and then select the best options. These options again, that looking into the nature of industry and the particular company, whether this particular option will it be applicable to this particular company and this nature of industries or not. Then state the decision criteria. An important step is to identify the few dimensions that will be used to decide between the options or alternatives. This is a step that many people they skip, and as a result it is difficult to reach a decision. So, if you will skip this particular, that is the what are the decision criteria. Now, what will be the decision criteria? Decision criteria, if you remember the template, we have gone through for the general, for the industry, for the competitors, for the strength and for the weakness. Whenever we have to take any particular decision or then selecting an option, then these criteria that has to be taken into consideration. Other side, what the other criteria can be the resources, because ultimately we are going to provide a solution, but if we do not have the resources, we cannot provide the solution. For example, for retrenchment of the employees offering for the VRS, voluntary retirement scheme. But if we are suffering from the financial losses, then there is no question that there will be VRS and golden shake hand scheme that we will be able to afford. If we are not able to afford this type of the schemes, then definitely what is required? Required is the criteria are to be very relevant criteria. Unless and until we are not having the relevant criteria, we will not be able to find out the right solution, and that is why it has been mentioned this is a step that many people skip. Now please understand, that is, we should not skip this particular step, and as a result if we skip this particular step, then it is difficult to reach a decision, and then there is no point in analyzing of the case, and then there will be no contribution of the case analyst. Explicitly state the decision criteria before deciding. So, therefore, we have to find out that what criteria we will give the importance. Examples include profit, that is a criteria, market share, that is a criteria, because when we will talk about the market share, and if you want to make the enhancement of the market share, maybe there the profit will reduce. So, one parameter will increase and other parameter will go down, and if this is happening, then in that case what will be the decision? So, we should be very clear, that is, whatever the, whether we want the profit or we want the market share, we want the growth, what are the impacts on the shareholders, implementation efforts, timings, the fit with overall vision, etc. So, these are the certain criteria that state decision criteria. Now, here we can also give the importance, that particular whatever there is a ranking of this criteria. That is, my first criteria will be the market share as compared to profit. Then if this is the decision criteria, then definitely after the pros and cons and evaluation and analysis, that we will find out the strategy. That strategy we will increase the market share and not the profit will be there. So, this will be also very important, that is, whenever we talk about these particular deciding the criteria, state the decision criteria, we have to be we have to consider, that is the whatever the points we are taken into the consideration for evaluation to get the best decision. Summarize the pros and cons. List out the support for and against each option or alternative. Review the summarized facts to find support for and against the alternatives. Now, in these options, definitely there are a number of options are there. For every option we have to evaluate, and in evaluate, then there will be some part will be in evaluation, there will be some criteria options that will be going for the for, and some criteria and options or some parameters that will be going for the against. So, if we are going to select any alternative, then we have to evaluate, we have to examine, that is the what is the for and what is the against, that criteria is there. Prioritize the pros and cons based upon decision criteria. So, therefore, on basis of this, the whatever the priorities will be there, automatically it will link in the dropping the pros and cons, that is what will be the based on decision criteria we should consider. So, therefore, here is the case template, that in the synthesizing, that is the question will be, that is the what is the priority. Right, an option or the hypothesis as I mentioned, and that is about the market share. So, what will be the decision criteria? Enhancement, investment. Now, this will be the decision criteria. What will be the pros? That is the market share. What will be the cons? That is the minimizing the profit. Now, the second key question, then third key question, and then this type of the template will be that we will be covering. Now, if we cover like this here for this particular case study in the Singapore International Airlines, what we will do? We will find out the question whether we should make the investment in VA or not, and the option and hypothesis is yes, we make the investment. What will be the decision criteria? ROI, right. So, here it means that we are looking for the money return on investment. What will be the pros? Whenever we will make the investment, then it will enable a lower cost product offering. In India, this is also very common practice. Access to younger demographics, then definitely those who are the younger demographic, then definitely they will be like to prefer to go by these airlines, and complementary routes will be there. So, that because they on those routes their other airlines are not going, so therefore complementary airline routes will be can be also be accessible. But what will be the cons? That is the competes with the Star Alliance. So, therefore, if you go by this the lower cost and all, then definitely you have to compete with the Star Alliances will be there. Second is limited resources or opportunity cost. So, if there is a limited resource or opportunity cost is there, then it will be very difficult that how to go for this particular decision, and if we are losing the opportunity cost, are there, then are we ready for that? So, that will be the question. And if we are making the use of limited resources, so is it okay for us? That is also will be a question. And third one is when you are going for this the lower cost product offering, that may affect the reputation. So, it will be $1 million question whether we are going for the investment in VA or not, because this will be the pros, this will be the cons. Even for this pros, then they because of the it will be may affect the reputation, and then in that case the organization may not prefer to go for this. What will be the overall strategy? The overall strategy's option or hypothesis will be low cost rather than the differentiation. So, therefore, if the overall strategy is the option is there is the low cost, then rather than differentiation, because if you go for the differentiation, then naturally the cost will be higher, there will be the investments will be there. So, if the low cost is the option strategy, if low cost is the option strategy, then long term profitability. So, we have to go for the long term profitability, as it will be low cost, then with a long period of time, yes, organization will come into the profit. Head to head with new competitors, then definitely the competition will increase, and then you have to face that particular competition. Seems to be the trend in the US, so that is a trend is there. Then fuel costs are rising, right, because of this particular decision, then the fuel costs are rising. What are the cons? Lose reputation as high quality provider. This is a challenge, because this if you are going by the low cost, then the reputation as a high quality provider will not be there, because if the cost is low, then the services will be of the moderate quality, and therefore the reputation will be that is they cannot provide the best quality because they are having the low cost. Goes against the infrastructure. So, if there is an infrastructure is there, and then that infrastructure has to be created, but because of the low cost, so it will be long term profitability. So, there will be no question of that infrastructure development, and if there is no infrastructure development, then there will be a technical issue. Third is cons is differentiation may be the only way to win. So, if you are going through the low cost, then you are not considered as a quality provider, then how why people will choose you, and that will be the differentiation. That if we are ready with the differentiation, that may be only allow us to win this particular competition, and then making the sustainable business. Another question is stay in Star Alliance, whether we should continue or we should not continue. and the option is given yes. If option is given yes, the decision criteria will be why. So, that is the market share growth. I have given this example in my the previous slide, that is the if you are going for the options and hypothesis of the market share, right, and then definitely that will be the enhancement. So, when we are going for the market share growth, then we have to stay into the star alliances. Here the pros will be, that is the cross selling opportunities to new customers, because of the star alliances there will be new customers who will join us, and if when they will join us, then we can showcase our strengths, we can showcase our services, and we will get a platform through the star alliances, that is yes, you are welcome, and then you find that is the what services we are providing, quality of services we are providing. Then it will be access to the additional routes quickly, and naturally because of the star alliances we will be able to get through the additional routes. What are the cons? The cons of lose control of scheduling. Now, because now you have tie up with the star alliances, then you have to also take it into consideration or permutation and combination. You cannot make your own scheduling, and then because there will be connectivity, and according to the connectivity you have to arrange your flights, and therefore in that case that is the we cannot schedule as per our choice, we have to dependent on others for that particular scheduling is there, which will be a difficult issue. May compromise the consistent quality of service. So, therefore, naturally there will be new customers, so there will be challenge, but you may not be able to provide the consistent quality of the services to this particular service provider, because they are going through these star alliances and may not be working through this particular situation. What is important? Important is this, that is whenever we are talking about this particular synthesizing of the case study, we have to identify the questions, that is whether we want to go, we do not want to go, it is yes or no, and then options or hypothesis will be there, and on basis of the options and hypothesis the decision criteria will be considered, and when there will be decision criteria there will be pros and cons will be there, and on basis of that pros and cons then the decision will be taken into consideration. So, we have talked so far about the framing, labeling, summarizing and synthesizing, identifying the key questions and then synthesizing it, state the decision criteria and summarizing the pros and cons, and so now we have to conclude. So, we will talk about the concluding, that is the how to conclude. In concluding, there are certain parameters. The parameters are take a position, that is how a position we have to stand. For example, star alliances yes or no, with the low cost yes or no, or we can differentiation yes or no, what differentiation strategy would you like to adopt, and therefore we have to take a position and decision is to be taken. Identify the few key supporting facts. Now, we have gone through these particular options and evaluation of options. If these are the options which we are going to evaluate, then decision criteria are there, then pros and cons we have discussed. So, we should not be it should not be difficult for us to identify the few key supporting facts, because these key supporting facts will come from our analysis of the pros and cons, and therefore, whenever we are taking a decision, whether it is a market share or differentiation or the low cost, then all these decisions they will be supported by a very important key fact will be there. On basis of this we will discuss the implementation. The implementation will be discussed on basis of this concluding session. So, what is important is, most important is this, that is the decisions which are based on framing, labeling, summarizing, synthesizing, and finally we are talking about, that is these are the particular supporting facts, and on basis of these supporting facts which we have evaluated with the pros and cons, then we can make the implementation. And if we decide to make an implementation, then we should discuss how to make the implementation. And one more important last point is, that is about the mentioning the risk in this slide, and that means that we should not forget that any decision which is based on this case analysis, it is based on certain assumptions, certain facts, certain considerations. So, anything which changes, so if the factors changes, or the strategy changes, or any step changes, there is social, technological, economical, ecological, then legal, if this process changes, then definitely in that case also, then there will be the implementation will change. And finally, these while changes are there, the risk we cannot avoid. Always in the decision making process there will be risk, as I mentioned, there are certain considerations. So, considerations will lead to the risk. As soon as the consideration will change, the risk will go up or down. So, that part will be there. So, how to conclude? In key question, what is the answer is, that is, take a position. This is the exciting end to analysis. The first step is to decide what best supported answer is to the key question. So, we had the key questions, and then now we are having the answers to the key questions. So, do not be afraid to take a stand, even if we feel that we do not have enough data, any position is better than no position. That principle we have to keep in mind, because the trend is to be told that is okay, you have come out with the solution, speak out, do not worry, because if you speak out a particular position, then solution, then definitely there will be, may not be the enough data, but decision is decision, and then it is better than not to take a decision. So, any position is better than no position. Avoid the typical compromise solution, pursue both of the alternatives. So, therefore, in that case we have to avoid that alternative, the typical compromise solution, and then come out with our own strategies. We have to come out with our own formulas, and then we have to pursue both of the alternatives. So, need not to worry whether we will be successful or will not be successful. Identify the few key supporting facts. What are those key supporting facts? Pull out the most important support from the summaries and pros and cons analysis. So, therefore, in that case it will be very important, that is, we are able to pull out the whatever the most important support is from, has to be taken into the pros and cons analysis. The best arguments are clear statements that are supported by the 2-3 key data based observations, and these 2-3 key based data based observations that will give the support to identify the supporting facts. Be very familiar with the underlying assumptions, facts and numbers when you present in class. So, therefore, when the trainee will come and when he will make the presentation, ask him, that is, do not worry, that is the whatever the data you have considered, because we have gone through this framing, labeling, so they are summarizing, synthesizing. So, therefore, in that case you need not to worry, trainees need not to worry, come out and take the key steps, assumption, facts and numbers. Whenever there he is proposing any solution, come out with the particular facts and numbers. Discuss the implementation. So, one way to differentiate a good case analysis is the consideration of what it would take to implement the recommendation, because finally we are going to give a recommendation. A solution has to be proposed, and to propose that solution, what is to be done? Think in terms of the few key action steps. Now, we are suggesting the key points, key action steps, the strategies. So, therefore, we have to think, and that must be taken, and then we should not go back. Once we have decided with all the systematic evaluation, not haphazardly, but with the systematic evaluation of the case study, analysis of the case study, whatever we have decided, then on basis of that we have to go take a decision, and we must go by that particular decision. A checklist for the consideration includes changes in staff, maybe that is the some positions that you have to reshuffle. Then the style, that leadership style may be, that is the what leadership style is existing, in what leadership style you propose. Then the systems change or the structure change, shared values and skills, then all these particular parameters, right, that may be required to change. And if it is that is required to be change it, because we should believe our decision, that whatever decision we have taken, that is the very appropriate decision, and if it is an appropriate decision, then need not to worry, because it is based on the complete analysis. And if it is based on the complete analysis, so whatever the checklist is there for the staff, style, system, structure, shared values and the skills are there, then if you want to make them the change it. Then mention risks, but we should not be blind, and when we should be very clear that yes, whatever decision we are taking based on the proper thorough analysis of the case, but still always there will be certain risk. The final step is to identify the risk and contingencies that may be encountered if the recommended course of action is pursued. What is that? This is the chance to show that you have completed a thorough analysis and considered what may go wrong. So, therefore, in that case you are not scared, that is we have done this particular points, we have created the options, we have evaluated the options, and then we are comparing the solutions, we have taken the best solutions, but we also know that there is a risk, and therefore, there is nothing to worry, that is even after a thorough analysis there may be things may go wrong, and we are aware about that. So, do not underestimate the power of the caveat, right. So, what will be the situation, and which situation, what will be the forces, and under those forces how will we operate, then definitely we cannot underestimate the power, and therefore, yes, any situation can occur. Now, here I would like to take the example of a case. This is the same case of the Singapore International Airlines strategy with a smile, and what are the learning objectives. This case is designed to be used in a module on business strategy and can be used to illustrate intangible sources of competitive advantage. The case helps to develop a framework for understanding the concept of differentiation based competitive advantage. Now, this is the strategy, that is they have to make the differentiation and they have to also focus on the competitive advantage. It illustrates how an organization implementing a strategy of differentiation needs to design its entire value chain, which is intended to be outstanding in every value activity that it performs. So, therefore, whatever an organization implementing a strategy of differentiation, then that differentiation strategy is need to be entire value chain create with the intent to the outstanding in every value activity. So, on basis of that synthesizing the pros and cons and that evaluation, that we should be intent to be the outstanding in the every value activity that is to be performed. So, what is the answer key? The answer key is a sample set of possible answer is presented in this section to the Singapore International Airlines, that is strategy with a smile, Thunderbird 2001 case. Remember to try the case on your own first using the suggested approach, tips and templates from the preceding slides. So, what we train to the trainees? We train to the trainees that there are certain templates are there, there are certain key points are there are certain pros and cons that you have to consider. Finally, you have to recommend a particular strategy, and then that this approach right from that is the framing, labeling and synthesizing, concluding and remark is there. So, solutions are provided. All these templates from the preceding slides that should lead to a solution, providing a solution. You very well may come up with a different and additional concepts. So, everybody may come out, different trainees may come out with the different solutions than those shown here, but remember it is not the actual answer, but the process that leads to learning. So, therefore, in case study, how one look into the case study, what parameters he looks into the case study, it is difficult to say that what is the right or what is the wrong answer is there, but the process, whatever the process is created, that process will leads to the learning process. And for the case templates into the concluding is, that is a risk, that risk and that implementation, and the risk that to the implementation will be based on the overall recommendation. So, whenever there is a overall recommendation, right, so these risk factors, right, and then this implementation. So, these overall recommendations, they play a very important role, and this is taught in the as a case study method, under case study method for effective decision making. If we are conducting a decision making training program, then the case study, these templates, going through these pros and cons, considering the framing, labeling, concluding, synthesizing, summarizing, synthesizing, then concluding all these parameters, and finally providing the options, providing the solution, that will become a very important part, that is from the risk to the implementation. And this is based on the decisions taken by that particular trainee as a overall recommendation. So, if overall recommendations are made, then those recommendations are the strategies basically. The strategies may be the differentiation strategies, maybe the low cost strategies, maybe the market share strategy, whatever the key questions were there, on those key questions these overall recommendations will be there, and then that will be implementation. So, how to minimize the risk? Risk can be minimized only with the help of the key supporting facts. One formula, because the decision is based scientifically analysis of the key supporting facts. Whatever the key supporting facts are there, those have been taken into the consideration, eliminated unrelated, related most important information is taken, options are considered, options are evaluated, decisions are evaluated, taken into the right prospects, and then they are going into the these facts, the figures of that particular case given in the case study, or any information in decision making process. So, there one should not hesitate. Taken means taken. If the decision is taken, it is taken. There can be the group discussion, there can be the inputs, but one has to take a decision, and this decision will take into the implementation process. Now, take this particular template in the as an example into the Singapore International Airlines case. So, risk, what will be the risk? Alliances do not deliver, because star alliances are there, they do not deliver sometimes. Costs get too high for a particular organization. Other airlines act first, so we will not be the early entrants, and if we are not early entrants, these are the risks are there. What are the implementations? Invest in VA, but go high end, then stay in alliances, expand high quality labor pool. So, if we are going by this implementation, is it possible? So, what we have to see? We have to see the facts. What are the facts? This is a critical time as technology and global reach require a high end international access airline. If it requires high end international access airline, expand the high quality labor pool will be there. Singapore International Airlines is the best strengths are high end service and global routes. So, therefore, in that case definitely we can go with these alliances and see best strengths and high end service and global routes that we can be adopted. Next is going low cost will damage long term profit potential. So, if there will be the long term profit potential, then going the low cost will be there. Now, what does it mean? It means that we have to make a recommendation. Recommendation will be Singapore International Airlines should set a strategic vision to be the leading global premier service airline, and if they want to be a leading global premier service airlines, they have to take the risk, they have to invest in VA, and on basis of these facts and then convert that Singapore International Airlines into the global premier service airline. If this is a decision, then definitely the case analysis, recommendation of the facts, risks are covered, implementation procedures are told, and then the recommendation, on basis of recommendation the organization will be sustainable and going for the high growth. So, what are the final tips? The final tips are: the key to success in case analysis is to take a structured approach to organizing and using facts, the lessons of learning to the participants. It is easy to get carried away with too much data and lose sight of the need for a clear story with a few supporting ideas. Prepare for multiple outcomes and see the pros and cons, that is to be told to the trainees. Use hypotheses to focus analysis, but do not get personally attached to one possible solution. So, we have to be realistic and based on the facts. There is no one right answer, but there are better and worse ways to present ideas. So, therefore, always we whatever we think we have to present in a best way and try to see that is this becomes the right decision. Be structured, objective and thorough, and then definitely you will succeed in your decision making process and solving the problems and doing the case analysis. So, this is all about the case analysis and structures, and with the help of the example of Singapore International Airlines. Thank you.